Welcome to the Aspen Institute's Murdock Mind, Body, Spirit series program featuring Angela Duckworth in conversation with Dan Porterfield. I'm Crystal Logan, Vice President of Aspen Community Programs and Engagement here at the Aspen Institute. And I first want to thank our trustee, Jerry Murdock, and his wife, Gina, for making this program possible. Thanks to our audience for tuning in for this important conversation. As I introduce our guests today, you'll find links to their full bios in the chat. And if you have questions, please type those into the Q&A feature at any time during the event. Angela Duckworth is the founder and CEO of Character Lab, which is a nonprofit whose mission is to advance scientific insights that help children thrive. She co-hosts with Stephen Dubner the podcast No Stupid Questions, which I love. She is professor at University of Pennsylvania and a MacArthur Fellow. She has advised the World Bank, NBA and NFL teams, and Fortune 500 CEOs. She completed her undergraduate degree in Advanced Studies Neurobiology at Harvard, where she graduated magna cum laude. With the support of a Marshall Scholarship, she completed her Master of Science in Neuroscience at Oxford. She completed her PhD in psychology as a National Science Foundation Graduate Fellow at the University of Pennsylvania. And her TED Talk is one of the most viewed of all time. And her book, Grit, is a #1 New York Times bestseller. Welcome, Angela. Dan Porterfield is president and CEO of the Aspen Institute. He was previously president of Franklin and Marshall College. He was named a White House Champion of Change in 2016. He holds bachelor's degrees from Georgetown and Oxford. He earned his PhD at the City University of New York Graduate Center. We are honored and thrilled to host both of you here today. And with that, over to you, Dan. Thank you.
Thank you, Crystal, and thank you to Gina and Jerry Murdock and all who are attending, and especially to Angela Duckworth, leader, friend, thinker, social influencer, and extraordinary professor at University of Pennsylvania, scholar, so much more. Angela, how are you doing today?
I'm fine. Thank you so much. And I just want to amplify, thanks to Crystal and the whole team for having us here. Especially me. You get to be here all the time.
It's a good place to be, too. So maybe we can get you to be our scholar in residence sometime. You can come out to Aspen and hang with us for a whole summer.
I'd love that.
Well, the book, Grit, and the idea of grit that you developed and researched has influenced millions. For many like me, reading your work has allowed us to understand ourselves or important people in our lives in a new way. And that, in my case, involves my mom, who I think was the epitome of grit, now that I have the vocabulary you've given us. And I think also my wife and our children, because so much of what you've helped us to understand is important. My wife, with me, we've tried to emphasize with our children's lives. Also, as an educator, when I was president of Franklin and Marshall College, we developed a talent strategy through which we tripled our enrollment of low-income students quite quickly between 2011 and 2013, and then sustained it through the time I was president through 2018 with fabulous results for all students, including low-income students, but for all students. So a lot to talk about, but with a lot of gratitude for your work. What if we start letting our audience get to know a little bit about you yourself? How did you grow up, and what led you to gravitate towards psychology and to this, human-centered research?
So, Dan, I was born in Philadelphia, actually down the street. So I'm in Philadelphia today, and I was born in Philadelphia. My parents immigrated from China in their 20s, and I, third of 3 children, found myself in a family that was quite occupied with achievement. And I think it was my dad more than my mom, who every morning and every night, and every hour in between, like, was just thinking about success and his own kids' success, their lack of success, which one of us was most successful, how do we compare to our cousins in Boston? Not well, by the way. How successful was he as a chemist? Would he win the Nobel Prize? No. And I think that gave me a personal obsession with human achievement that took a different turn from my dad's in the following way. My dad really thought a lot about who was smart, which of his children was the smartest. Again, how smart were his kids compared to the Boston cousins and so forth. And I knew when I was a little girl that I wasn't the smartest person in the family. I knew I wasn't even the smartest kid in my homeroom. And I guess I had a sense of statistics where I was like, if I am not the smartest kid in my homeroom, I cannot be the smartest person in the world or even close. And what I came to study as a psychologist is the psychology of effort, which is very different from the psychology of like everything comes easily to me, or the psychology of natural ability. And a lot of what I do, but not all, is on this one characteristic that does influence how much cumulative effort people put towards what they do, and that is grit, the combination of passion and perseverance for especially long-term goals. So grit is all about stamina over months and years, and it's not at all related, it turns out, to talent. So when you measure IQ or physical talent and you measure grit using, for example, questionnaires, the correlation usually is zero.
No, it's so interesting that you found your way into this. I guess I'll say through the lens of sensing what your own assets were in the sort of dynamic of how your family thought about it all.
Well, there is this expression in academia that research is usually me-search. And you're either studying what you have or you're studying what you don't have, but there's some very personal connection. I think that goes beyond academia. So much of what people pursue in their lives is very related to their story, and the idiosyncratic way that their story is being told, and then your work becomes like another chapter in that. But for me, it is fairly personal in that sense. And I don't think I'm the only person who like looks to their left, looks to the right, and realizes like, that natural ability is not going to be, what puts you, not just ahead of other people, because that's not really the way I think about it, but just like, closer to what you want to do with your life.
So was there in your own life story, in your undergraduate years, your graduate school or early work, was there a case when sort of in there where you yourself, looking back, say that this idea of passion plus persistence in pursuit of a long-term goal, that was you?
Like, was I gritty?
Yeah.
I think I had half of grit before I had the other half. And now that I've been, thinking about this with a lot of other people, and actually I'm as a professor, so I get to, hang out with, 18 to 22-year-olds. I'll say this, I think a lot of people come to it the way I did. For me, perseverance came first. I was a hard worker growing up. I was a hard worker in high school. I was a hard worker probably to some extent in middle school or even elementary school. I didn't mind showing up early. I didn't mind staying late. I didn't mind, trying hard and learning, from feedback. Okay, that was a little more challenging, but I could do that. The part of grit, which I think is actually more elusive for most people, as it was for me, was a sense of what to work hard at, right? So yeah, I've got perseverance, but can somebody please give me a passion? And I had 10 years, Dan, between graduating from college and the epiphany, hey, I should be a psychologist. And during that decade, there were a lot of tortured, sessions with myself, with my journal, with my husband about what to do. So for me, perseverance came more easily than passion. And I find that again and again with the young people that I talk with, that there's so many people who feel like they have a work ethic, they're reasonably resilient, but they do not have a sense of purpose or direction.
Yeah. Let's look at the elements of the equation, if you will, for a second. So, what do you mean by passion? Like having something that motivates you to give your best and do your best and be your best?
Well, when I say passion, I mean it in a very particular way. So it's for grit anyway, and the research that I do, it's really about the consistency of the direction you're working in over long periods, as opposed to the intensity. And maybe the word passion is something that sounds like intensity, like, wow, this person, like on a scale from 0 to 10 really likes this thing a 10. But what I'm talking about is, you talk to someone and they're like, you know what, I'm really interested in veterinary medicine. You're like, oh, wow, that's great. And you have a conversation with them. And then, 6 months later, they're still interested in veterinary medicine. And a year later, and then 5 years later, they're still in veterinary medicine. And like 10 years later, they still want to be a vet. And so that's the consistency of passion. The abiding devotion to some purpose that I mean. And I think that intensity is great, but I think actually it's consistency that is that rare thing that Isaac Newton, for example, when asked and maybe when introspecting as to how he discovered the laws of mechanics that govern rigid objects, which many scientists had wondered, like how can we understand, like how fast an apple is going to fall from a tree, or and Newton observed that many scientists would think about this problem, but after a week, a month, a year, 5 years, they walked away from that problem and they worked on another problem, which is perfectly reasonable thing to do because it was a very hard problem, but he never walked away. So I think there is this, are you willing to just like keep chipping away at something in this devoted, loyal sort of sense? And that is something that I craved, Dan, but didn't have. Yeah. So I wanted to have something that would, keep me engaged for really the rest of my days. But I didn't know what that would be.
Yeah, that's thank you. What a beautiful answer. So let's go to the persistence part for a second. And I heard you mention both hard work and resilience. And so I suspect both are elements of what you mean by persistence.
I think of persistence as a little p persistence and then uppercase P persistence. So it's like lowercase. And let's start with resilience, because turns out we're in a global pandemic of historic proportions. And so we've all had a little practice, I think, whether it was wanted or not, in resilience. Resilience, when scientists talk about it, it's really the ability to overcome adversity. And then scientists will quibble as to whether resilience means, before the adversity you were here, and then adversity happens, and then you bounce back, just like resilient sounds, you bounce back to the same level. And some scientists would say, resilience is really bouncing back to some new level that's actually higher, where you're stronger or better, your relationships are more meaningful, something's better after the adversity. But regardless, that's what adversity is: a response to challenge, a response to failure, setbacks. And that's why I call it like uppercase P or capital P perseverance, because it is this kind of like, well, in the face of, real challenge, like how do you do? But then there's lowercase p perseverance, which is what you need every day, no matter whether it's a good day or a bad day, which is to keep chipping away in a hard work style that Anders Ericsson, the cognitive psychologist, kind of better known for the 10,000 hour rule, which happy to talk about. He called it deliberate practice, but that is the practice where you are constantly trying to improve at least one thing, and usually just one thing, with focus and then with feedback in this repetitive way that he found to be true of Olympic champions, like those we watched for the last 2 weeks, but also Nobel laureates or Scrabble championship players, chess masters, prima ballerinas, and on. So I think you need both kinds of perseverance.
Yeah. So passion plus persistence in the pursuit of goals, especially long-term and meaningful goals. And that is grit. And then your research, you've looked at examples of where grit seemed to be the decisive quality that allowed for achievement or success in realizing those goals. And you looked at all kinds of endeavors in which grit proved to be decisive. And will you talk about some of those endeavors and how you sort of proved the power of grit?
So the first really ambitious field study that I did, I think I was a second year graduate student when I thought, I want to study whether grit predicts dropping out or staying in at West Point, which is the nation's oldest military academy. And, whether you've been to the campus of West Point or not, you've probably heard of it. And you might know that, you need top test scores and top grades. So they're very often valedictorians. Excuse me. But you're almost always a varsity athlete. I mean, very often you're a captain of a varsity sport. Very often you're a captain of 3 varsity sports while getting top test scores and grades. And then there's the matter of the presidential, vice presidential, presidential, or congressional nomination just to apply. So it's a pretty elite group of women and men. And yet they have these periods of training, especially the very first summer of training, which is the highest attrition period during your 4 years. And it occurred to me that after spending what really end to end is about 2 years of an application process, clawing your way into this place, to drop out in the first 2 months might be, dropping out too early, at least for some, not for all. So I studied that by administering the grit scale in cooperation with the generals at West Point and the superintendent there, to the cadets on the second day that they had arrived. So the day that you get your haircut, for example. And then we waited to see, who would make it through the highest attrition periods of training, and then who would even graduate with their diploma to serve in the US Army for 5 years, which is the requirement. And we just did a meta-analysis, which we published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. And it says that grit is a strikingly good predictor, an astonishingly reliable predictor of who will make it through the high attrition periods as well as all 4 years. And it's not related to West Point's measures of intellectual or physical talent. And those measures of talent do predict certain long-term outcomes, but they are not a very good predictor of sticking it out during the periods of West Point where, many of the cadets are dropping out.
Yeah. So I've heard lots of educators in all different levels of work, working together and theorizing. How might we foster grit? And sometimes parents, sit around and talk about that too. How do we, we were grittier. How do we make sure our kids are gritty? Whether that's true or not, who knows? But what do you think about that concept of the promotion of, the activation of, the teaching of grit?
Well, I've got 2 daughters, as you know, Dan, and one is 19 and one is 18. And I do want them, to be grittier than less gritty. There are other things, by the way, as a mother, that I would like more, that are, honesty, kindness, empathy, and so forth. But do I want them to be gritty? Of course, because I think that knowing what excellence is in your own life is a wonderful thing. We all watch the Olympics, right? Why do we watch the Olympics? I even cry at the commercials at the Olympics, right? I find it truly inspiring to see what these athletes can do. But I want to go further than that and say that every young person can achieve excellence. Anybody can learn to do something. And with that pride of saying yeah, I did that well. And to be on that journey to and I think I can do it a little better tomorrow, right? I think every young person should and can aspire to that. So I want my daughters to have that sense of excellence in their own lives as well. I think as a parent, one of the things that I see parents do not well that I would like to see done differently is, very often parents are very impatient for their kids to, get on a track. It's it feels too late if you haven't started baseball by the time you're 14, if you don't know that you're going to be a science major by the time you're 16, there's this kind of premature, path setting. And one of the things that psychologists, I think, would agree on is that one very important developmental condition is autonomy. Kids need to make choices. Even 5-year-olds, when my daughters were in kindergarten, and I wanted them to learn to practice, and I wanted them to learn how to, stick with something, even when they felt like they wanted to quit. We, said, in the Duckworth family, everybody has to do a hard thing, and that will require you to finish what you start. If you start track, as my daughter did, and you decide after your very first track meet, as Lucy discovered, that she doesn't like competing with other kids, big discovery, very interesting, very important. But I said, well, it's great that you learned that. You only have 7 more weeks to go, because she signed up for track. And I was not going to let her just say like, oh, okay, I've changed my mind on the second day. Even then, here's where respect for autonomy comes in. I didn't choose for her to do track. She chose track. My daughters knew they had to do a hard thing, but I never told them which hard thing. They were 5 and they were like, I want to do this, I want to do that. They have ideas. So I think one of the first things that parents need to remember, but also one of the most enduring things that parents need to remember, is that, your kids are individuals. And as Bill Damon at Stanford, who runs the Center for Adolescence there, is a very wise thinker on this, nobody has ever become great doing what their parents told them to do.
Yeah.
And I would agree entirely.
So and sometimes people that think that what you're saying is just keep pounding your head, just keep working hard. They miss that other point about the passion, which comes out of autonomy and comes out of a sense of agency. But so still, let's just for a moment, imagine we were, starting a school together, you and me and Crystal Logan, and it was going to be called the Penn Aspen Institute School. And we were hoping all the people listening in were going to maybe send their kids here. What would we do in our school? Say it's a pre-6th grade. Some of the things you'd say are good to do in an educational setting that foster that combination of passion and persistence.
I love this thought experiment. We should absolutely start a school. Let's get Jackie Bezos to help us. And
Okay.
I want to say that Jackie, who's a great friend of Aspen Institute and just a friend of all of ours, we were talking last week about what teenagers really need. And I think by extension, the kids before they become teenagers. But here's my thought about like what I see as a through line in healthy thriving, really, not just healthy development, but thriving in young people. 2 things. One is I think like all young people need at least one extremely stable, unconditional, loving relationship in their life. I mean, it is very hard to develop into a whole person unless you feel like somebody like just loves you no matter what, and unconditionally in the sort of center of the universe way. I think for many of us, it's their parents, or our parents. But I think, in some of the people I've studied, it was a high school trigonometry teacher. In one case, a volleyball coach. In another, a pastor. It's somebody who really is there for you. So I think stable human relationships are the foundation for all healthy development. And the second thing is what Jackie and I spent a little more time talking about, which is that I think kids, especially as they get into their middle and high school years, they do best when they're into something. That there's something that they're into. Is it skateboarding? Is it programming? Is it social justice? Is it, whatever it is? There's an infinite number of things. But what I really worry about is the 16-year-old who's not into anything. That there's just like, they're just sort of incredibly bored and disengaged in and out of school. So what Jackie and I were talking about, and maybe this would be the premise for a high school if we ever got together and started one, which is, can we, help young people, find something that they can get into? And I've spent a lot of time with admissions officers, including my admissions officer who let me into Harvard in 1988. And Fitz, as he's called, would say that it's not that we want to make sure that every 16-year-old is still doing the same thing when they're 26 and 36 and 46. they're probably going to get into something else, right? They discover something new in the next chapter of their lives. Nevertheless, I think developmentally, to get into something, to know what practice is like, to try things that are hard, to feel what it's like to go deeper. There's so much of this like TikTok video culture where it's like you're just skimming the surface. You watch something for 2 seconds, but what I like to see a young person do is at least in one thing to come back to it and to come back to it year after year, just for the sake really of experiencing depth of passion.
Yeah.
So how to do that is another story, but we would have a lot of late nights together if we ended up doing this.
It'd be fantastic. And I've certainly seen exactly what you just said on point 2 in the college context, where the major, the independent study, the significant campus leadership, the participation on athletics team, and more can provide that kind of a proving ground that you have the stick-to-itiveness to really go deep. So take a minute for the audience to maybe address the question of growth mindsets, which Carol Dweck has popularized, and like grit, now is part of the everyday vernacular of educators and families. How does the notion of a growth mindset connect to the notion of grit?
Carol Dweck is my idol. I was once asked by Anders Ericsson, the deliberate practice cognitive scientist, who do you idolize? And he was asking me because he thought it was a very useful thing for each and every one of us to ask that question, like, who are you trying to be? And I thought, okay, well, if you're asking me that question, I want to be Carol Dweck. So that's my answer to Anders. And I'll tell you about what growth mindset, her really revolutionary idea, I think, really is. It's a belief. A growth mindset is a belief, a theory that human abilities like intelligence can change, that they are fundamentally malleable. That if, for example, I say, Dan, help me get smarter about, politics, help me get smarter about math, that you won't look at me like I'm crazy. You'll think like, oh yeah, let me help you get smarter. You would believe that I could literally be smarter in those things. The opposite is a fixed mindset, which is the deep down belief that, sure, you can learn skills, but you can't really change how smart somebody is at anything. And what Carol has discovered in her research and, her students who are now, all grown up and very eminent themselves, including people like David Yeager, is that it is in the face of challenge when growth mindset matters most. I mean, when you're winning everything, it probably doesn't matter all that much which mindset you have. But when you stumble and you fall, and you screw up because of your own mistakes or adversity happens to you, that a growth mindset gives you a rational reason to get up and to look back and learn something and then move forward. Whereas a fixed mindset tends to encourage hiding behavior. I just don't want anyone to realize that I'm not as smart as they think, and to avoid challenge and risk taking. Yeah. Grit and mindset are growth mindset are positively correlated. And the last thing I'll say on that is they are positively correlated over time, Dan. So when we follow young people longitudinally, for example, adolescents, and you measure growth mindset and grit, what you find is that one leads to the other in this kind of virtuous cycle.
Yeah, and I've thought about the two concepts together quite a bit in looking and trying to help students. And one thing I've observed is that sometimes educators themselves have a fixed mindset. And so they project to students that they believe their abilities are fixed, which then can reinforce that belief in students. And I don't know, is that something you've seen, or is that something we have to watch out for?
You've put a finger on exactly what I think Carol and many of her collaborators are working on right now. Having established that these mindsets can very powerfully determine our behavior and our motivation and our success. She now wants to ask, well, how would we get kids to have a growth mindset? And very much she's interested in, for example, the teacher who I remember when I was in college. So this is now 3 decades ago. And I was trying to get an after school enrichment program started where we would build solar powered hot dog cookers after school, et cetera. And as I was told by the principal, I went, classroom to classroom, knocked on the door, and they gave me 2 minutes to make my commercial. And I would do my song and dance and say it was going to be really great. And we were going to make a solar powered hot dog cooker out of tin foil and a cardboard box. And I remember this one teacher, Mr. C, because one kid was like, I'll do it. And he was like, oh, not you. She means the smart ones. And I was like, wow, you have to be with this person every day. I was like, so absolutely. And I think most teachers get into teaching because they do have a growth mindset and they believe in the potential of children to get smarter and to learn. But I do think we have to, probably ask ourselves, what unintended messages did we inherit and what unintended messages are we passing along, and we casually say things without really reflecting.
Yeah. And of course, this can happen with identities where we say, well, girls are good at something and boys are good at something, and that just gets passed along, even though it's a total myth. So you wrote, you did research for a period of time. You wrote a book that has had profound influence. I could talk about how it's influenced people I know. Sometimes individual human students have said, I'm gritty, and they mean that in such a positive way. And sometimes whole bodies of work, like I think the sort of remaking of the SAT exam that David Coleman led, was in part done to emphasize the virtue and value of practice, which you've commented on is such an important part of both a growth mindset, I would say, but also grit. But so at the same time, that you're a dynamic thinker, so you put a big idea in a big book in 2016, and before that in other ways. And people give you feedback and you do more research. So what's evolved for you over the last 5 years in this concept?
A few things. I've grown a bit, and even I'll say changed my mind because I was wrong a little bit. Maybe I shouldn't even qualify; just say wrong. 5 years ago. So one of the things that I wrote about in 2016 was that when I look at a really gritty person, right? Again, think of your favorite Olympian, since the Olympics just were with us, or think of your favorite whoever that you admire. That I would say, oh, these people have a goal hierarchy, underlying what they do. They have a top level goal. They have a compass. They have a reason why they're doing everything. And then that drives a kind of pyramid-like structure where then they have mid-level goals. This is where we need to be in 10 years. And then they have 5-year goals. And then they have these to-do list goals that are at the very bottom. They're like, this is what I got to do this afternoon, this week. And to me, that made a lot of sense. And to some extent, I do think it's true of somebody who in full maturity, has a sense of clarity and purpose, but also how it connects to their everyday task list. But here's where I think I was wrong. I think that there really are very few people, if any, who really have a pyramid of goals, written down or not even written down. And here's the reason why. I think we can have a compass of the kind of thing that you are working on, Dan. I know you do. You have a telos. I do too. Use psychological science to help kids thrive. That's true. So that's at the top. I absolutely have a to-do list. It's very detailed, actually. But if you ask me, Angela, what exactly are you going to be working on in 5 years, right? If you say August, but 5 years from now, so 2026, what are you going to be working on? And I'll I don't know, Dan. I don't know. A lot's going to happen between now and then. So what I think I was wrong on is that even though you can have a telos, a compass, these are my values and interests, this is what I'm working on, even though you should have a to-do list, and frankly, I think you should have a 1, 2, or 3 year plan, I don't think anybody has much in the middle. So there's this big gaping space, that is not at all like a pyramid. So I think I was very much incorrect on that. And I say this because I've tried to talk people through their pyramids and help them create pyramids. And I've talked to very successful people about their goals. And I think it was Danny Kahneman, the Nobel laureate, who said to me recently, because I was trying to map out what I was going to do. And he just said at some point, almost laughing, he was like, Angela, do you really think you're going to know what you're going to be doing in 3 or 4 years? He said, I don't. And I was like, good point. So anyway, that's a big revision.
Yeah.
The other thing, if we want to get into it, is I think there have been legitimate criticisms of this character and grit approach from those who feel like it draws attention away from structural changes, race and class issues in this country. So we can talk about that. But I think
say a word about that. That was next to ask you about.
there have been scholars, but also just, humans, right, who just have been thoughtful. And I'm thinking of, for example, Bettina Love, who's a professor of education, who's said, I think some of these words that we use, like grit and character, can be problematic if misunderstood. And also, I think, again, I think these are legitimate perspectives. They can make it seem like all you need is like a sense of personal agency, and nobody needs to make society more fair or equal. Nobody has to take care of changing zoning ordinances and public school funding and, other things that are like just objective realities that make it very, very difficult for some people to succeed in our society. And I think that is, a very important voice to be amplified. And I would hope that anytime I talk about, a kid developing a growth mindset and learning to have a passion and figuring out how to practice the way experts do, that it would not only not take away from a concern for like the contextual supports that a human being would, but also that we would put more money and more attention, more than money. I think about my own daughters. I think they grew up to be pretty gritty people. How did that happen? My husband and I, and their lives, there was so much investment in their context. So context and character ought not be thought of as either or. I think context and character ought to be thought of as both and.
Yeah. I read a study not too long ago that sort of suggested that because of the presence of racism, some very successful Black men and Black women, but it was focused mostly on men, even as they achieve, are also experiencing tremendous daily stress that's unhelpful to their physical health. And that the irony of success, but also coping with racism, with more racism and different racism, and a constant internal sort of dynamic of pressure and awareness of race-based constraint. I'm not sure I'm describing it perfectly.
No, you did a pretty good job. There are researchers, I'm thinking of, the Northwestern University psychology researchers, Chen and Miller, but among others, who have said, I think the title of some of their papers, like Stress Gets Under the Skin. And in particular, one thing that's really revealing about this research, it's not just that they're like physiological, immunological, cardiovascular, consequences of being chronically stressed. But I think maybe even more relevant to what's going on right now in our country is that being marginalized socially, being marginalized because of your identity, can be one of the most corrosive psychological experiences that you could have. So yes, it is bad to want for food. Yes, it is bad to be thirsty. But also this less tangible thing of feeling like you don't belong here, feeling like people don't truly respect you. It's a fundamental human need, and there's a tax that gets paid. So even if you're graduating summa cum laude and your law partner or whatever, that they're measuring a cost to that.
So my amateur answer to that has been, as a mentor to a number of young adults, has been to remind them, even as they are striving for success in their goals and aware of the presence of sexism, homophobia, racism, a variety of isms, that also there are values to nurture within that are about who they are, that is not directly related to their success at all. It's about what you said earlier: empathy, compassion, a sense of solidarity with others. Am I giving good advice when I say that?
I think you're giving good advice, and I think just that you're there for them, right? I think to feel like, as I said in the beginning, like I think every young person to develop well, to flourish, needs to feel some unconditional love, and to be an unconditional friend, even if that's not your role, to be the unconditional parent, or but just to be and to not have that person feel like their worth is a fragile thing, contingent upon, like always imperiled, but really is just, like the little children's book, The Runaway Bunny. And it's like, no matter what the bunny does, like the mom is like, yeah, but then I'm going to love you anyway. And the bunny's like, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, I'm going to make a sale, and I'm going to run away. And they're like, yeah, but I'm going to love you anyway. Yeah. And I really believe, when I think of Jackie Bezos, I know that not everybody on this webinar knows her, but like she is like that. She has this unconditional love that's just like pouring out of her at all times. And I remember thinking to myself, like, wow, that would have been some family to grow up in. Like that is what all young people need.
Yeah, and there's so much about their family that's very inspiring that if we had more time, I'd ask you about. But let me ask you about one more thing, which is I have been privileged to work with thousands of students of all different type, and especially at that moment of 18 to 22, and then maybe tracking later. And I think of some of the most gritty students I know who are people I admire so much, who had a moment whose idea was, yes, I'm passionate about my college education. Yes, I'm passionate for what it means for my community. I'll figure out the exact destiny here, but I'm going for it. And then they have that resilience and that hard work. And something else is needed. And just as the examples in my mind, one is somebody that persisted through a terrible disease in college and needed a psychologist to work with her about slowing down the way she was trying to fight the disease. Or in a second case, a young woman who was pounding her head against the wall and needed to realize with some help that it was okay to get help. She'd never gotten help before. And then a third one, a story that can almost make me cry to tell it, a young woman who was so passionate about soccer in college and college's success overall, had a knee injury, couldn't play, and was so devastated she couldn't function. It turned out, with help from a grief counselor, that her father's death 7 years before, the man that taught her soccer, was what came back to her in that moment when she couldn't play soccer and she couldn't wear his number out on the field.
Right, so she kind of like got to that.
Exactly. Block grief, 7 years of block grief. So how does that notion of getting this kind of help that outside of what you can do for yourself, in a way, fit with this notion of resilience and purposefulness?
So I want to tell all the very gritty people listening, and then also all of you who have like especially gritty kids, something to watch out for and to like take from those three stories, because Dan, they're all about how this really strong and amazing person at some point has to depend on someone else to get to the next, chapter, to get through something. And I say this in part because I think that actually it can be a little bit of the Achilles heel of people who are really gritty and strong and like practice longer. Like what happens when you fall flat on your face and you feel burnt out or exhausted, or you're going through episodes of depression, or you're injured, or whatever it is. And I think it's important to like share that every paragon of grit, even the like super duper famous ones, that you can imagine, at least the ones that I've had an opportunity to study and to interview, like they all have a story like this where, they were humbled at some point in their life and they didn't want to, but they really had to ask for help. And not in the way they wanted to. It wasn't pretty. It was like ugly crying, it was like not anything that at the moment they even thought was like going to end well, and I think if you could just know that and tell your kids like, hey, I was listening to this talk and this like researcher studies all these like world-class performers. And did you know that every one of them at some point, maybe it happens when you're 16, maybe it happens when you're, 21, maybe you get all the way to 35 without this happening, but then they really need somebody else in their life. And it's often a loved one in the form of a parent or a spouse, if you're that old. And then I will say for many people, it's a therapist or a coach in another way. And I think the lesson from this is that if the Achilles heel of a really gritty person is that it's hard to ask for help because you're used to sort of summoning the will to keep going on your own, then at least hopefully this conversation and those 3 stories that you told, Dan, will you'll have a little pattern recognition. You're like, oh, wait, I'm feeling burnt out, or I'm feeling not like myself. Like this is the part in the story where I need to ask for help. Like all of the great successful people all learn how to do.
Yeah, look at what Simone Biles taught us.
Yes. If you took the right moral from the story, then yes,
exactly.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I'd love to open it up for questions. I think Crystal Logan's going to join us. What a great interview! Thank you so much, Angela.
Thank you, Dan. Hi, Crystal.
Welcome back, Crystal.
Fantastic discussion. Thank you so much. Our first question from the audience is: how do you measure grit?
Not very well, but I have a questionnaire called the Grit Scale, and it is 12 items, and I've used it in research. I developed it as a first-year graduate student, so it's not a perfect questionnaire. Also, if you have younger children, if you go to characterlab.org, there's a grit playbook, and I developed a set of questions that should be readable at the dinner table. So it should be like whatever your age, you could just use those questions as a kind of a psychological selfie. Like you could read them and reflect on them.
I love that. Thank you. Second question, how has remote learning during the pandemic affected students, especially adolescents, overall well-being?
Character Lab works primarily with adolescents. So we do research in schools with middle school and high school students. And because we had data on well-being in 3 dimensions, social well-being, emotional well-being, and academic well-being, because we had it before the pandemic, and then throughout the pandemic, we could answer the question, at least directionally, like what are the consequences of being isolated during this historic moment? And what we find is socially, emotionally, and academically, how much you feel like you belong, your feelings of happiness and well-being, your academic engagement. Is what you're doing in school interesting? Is it important to you? Do you feel like you can succeed? That on every single dimension, the more isolated you are, the lower your well-being. And we did that in part because we were able to compare students who were fully isolated because they were completely remote. And then still in the pandemic, I know this will seem hard to believe depending on what your situation was, but students were going to school. And so we did comparisons. And I think the take home for me is not here's a very clear policy recommendation. I just think it means that in the calculus of what to do come fall, with all of the things that you have to consider as a parent or as a decision maker, just don't forget well-being of adolescents. And in that calculus, just remember, it's not just the little kids who suffer, but developmentally, all mammals, including people, have a transition between childhood and adulthood where it's not the thing to do to just be with your parents all the time. And so I do think young people need to be around other young people and around other adults who are outside the family to the extent it's possible, all things being equal.
Great, thank you. Okay, this next one is a really long one. We have all had to be more resilient this past year. And with the Delta variant of COVID-19 threatening to curtail our progress in defeating the coronavirus, it seems like it's as good a time as any to learn to utilize the tools we have to help build the psychological muscles we require to keep going. Do you have any tips to help build resilience in these difficult times?
The Delta variant has made me ponder, and I don't know that there's been any research on this, but this is what it's made me ponder as a psychologist, that human beings, we tend to be very goal-oriented, and then we sort of, the goal's over here, and then we kind of, if you were running a race, you would allocate your energy to be able to make it to the finish line, and you would use that goalpost as sort of okay, and what I think is happening in the pandemic is the goalpost just keeps getting moved. It's here's the goalpost, there's the finish line, run. And then it's oh, actually, I'm going to move it. Now I'm going to move it again. Now I'm going to hide the goalpost. I don't even know where it is anymore. And I feel at least in the last couple of weeks with news coming out, like it must make a lot of us feel that like you can't even find the goalpost anymore. And I will tell you, my intuitions as a psychologist is that it's extremely hard because many of us are good at, pushing to a certain point, but then when you keep getting it moved, you don't know what to do, and it can leave you feeling helpless, which can really be demoralizing. So what to do about it? I don't have any easy answers, but I will tell you something about optimistic people. So optimistic people who tend to thrive, even under conditions of adversity. It's not that they're just sort of sunny by disposition people, but they tend to focus a lot of their attention on the small things that they can change and that they have some control over. So you may not be able to forecast or to change the trajectory of the Delta variant. You may not be able to change yourself individually in an easy way. Like how many people in your neighborhood are vaccinated or wearing masks, or what decisions are going to happen. But you can change small things. Like you can say, today at dinner, I'm going to ask everybody this question that I think is going to bring a smile. Like, I'm going to send a text message to my mom that just says like, hi, Mom, love you so much. Like little things like I'm going to donate $1 to this cause. Like it's only a way of like creating a goalpost, I think, for yourself that you can control and, has a positive effect on other people. So it's not, panacea for anything, but I think it's a lesson that I'm trying to follow in my day and think like, well, I can definitely smile when I see Dan and like tell him I think he's a great leader. Like, I have control over that, and it's true.
That's great. Thank you. I think you're a great leader too, Dan. We all do. Our next question is, who do you think is more attractive to an employer, the passionate or the persistent?
Believe it or not, an NFL team, to be unnamed, asked me this question about 2 potential recruits. Again, to be unnamed. The good thing about me in sports is like I know so little that I have no idea who they're talking about really, except to see these different profiles. And one of these players they assessed to be like higher in passion, but not so high in, and then the opposite, right? And they asked me like, who do I take? And it's a very good question. I am guessing that passion is something that if you can teach this person like a work ethic and the skills of resilience, great. But it's hard. And I'm not saying you can't develop a passion, but anyway, it's sort of 6.5 of one, 5.5 of the other. But I do think, when somebody is really interested, take a kid, right? And you're like, wow, this kid does not know how to practice. They do not yet have a great work ethic. Like they seem to crumble at this first time, like, they lose any, race or competition. But you're like, but they really seem to be interested in track. Like it's interesting, like it's fun for them. They enjoy it. Like, so then I would be like, all right, I can teach that kid work ethic. Okay, I can like teach them the skills of mindset and resilience. But it's hard to like give somebody an intrinsic interest in a domain.
That's a good point. Our next question, this person says, thanks for the wonderful discussion about grit. There was some research found that more intelligent individuals benefited more from practice. And I think it was basically talking about there was an interaction between intelligence and practice. I wonder, how do you see intelligence? Is intelligence important? Can a gritty person be successful without intelligence?
I have a doctoral student, a PhD candidate, who I believe, his name is Danny Southwick, and I believe he may be the only NFL quarterback in history to go and get his PhD in psychology, which is what he's trying to do right now. And he's literally studying that exact question. And I will tell you what Danny would say. Danny believes that, these differences in IQ, and I put it in air quotes only because the longer I study human nature, the less I really know what IQ is. And I'm not saying it's not anything. I'm just saying the more I stare at it, I'm like, but what is it really? Is it interest? Is it like, what is it? Anyway, Danny would say of IQ and learning and practice that the research in his view says that when you have an advantage in IQ, then in the very early days, you do learn faster and, you can outperform. But when you look at the long run, for example, chess players who've been playing for like 10, 15, 20 plus years, then when you look at the relationship between their IQ and their chess score, that there's almost no relationship. And the relationship certainly was stronger when they were younger. So that's what Danny Southwick would say.
Wow, that's great. Thank you. This might be our last question. It's a two-part question. Is it possible to develop grit in an adult who may not have grown up in an environment where grit was developed? And two, is there a good and ethical strategy for helping to develop grit amongst coworkers?
Well, a lot of thought went into those two questions. I think, I am an optimist. I do pay attention a lot to what we can control. And I think that we're kind of in the middle of a, like a psychological revolution, as it were. Like I think it is possible to change yourself. And there's research that suggests that, you can change your personality. I know it sounds like crazy, but I have a growth mindset about it. And I think if like the way my grandparents were raised and the way my mother and father were raised, and it was so psychologically unsophisticated, if the Simone Biles story had happened 30 years ago, the appreciation for emotions and what leads to them and, motivations, it was so primitive. Now I think we can all process it at a certain level of sophistication, even if we don't agree. And given all of that, I do think it's possible to change, even if you didn't, grow up with the most optimal circumstances. And in terms of coworkers, well, it's always, hard to guarantee change in other people, largely because they might not want to. But I do think that we're all modeling for each other. And I have been around people who just bring out my best. They're so warm and kind that when I'm with them, I'm a little warmer and kinder, and then honestly the opposite. So I do think that together we can change, but also that we shouldn't try to make other people change. The most we can do probably is to set an example, including, by the way, of humility, because as great as anyone is, nobody's perfect.
Thank you. It's a great way to close. Dan?
It is. Crystal, thank you for organizing. Jillian as well, thank you for organizing. And Angela, and Zoe, thank you also for organizing. And Angela, the original name of the Aspen Institute was the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies. And
I didn't know that.
Yes, and it came out of this belief of our founders that in a world coming out of genocide, World War, the beginnings of the Soviet Union, as well as changing technologies of work, that the individual with human dignity was in some peril. And this idea that the humanistic is something we are called to appreciate, bring into our policy work, our management work, our research is really at our heart. And I truly feel in listening to you today, as well as being familiar with your research, that you are in that tradition of humanistic inquiry and helping us to understand our human capacities and human nature so much better. And so can I make you an honorary founder of the Aspen Institute and thanking you for today?
Absolutely. I'm a super fan of the Aspen Institute, everything it stands for and everything it's doing right now. So thanks, Dan, and thanks, Crystal, and everyone who made this event possible.
All right. Thank you all.
Yep. Thank you, Angela, and thank you for your profound work. And it's truly a gift to humanity. Thanks to our audience for tuning in and for all of the great questions. All of our community events this summer have been free and open to the public. So if you are in a position to give, please click on the link. You can also click on the link to purchase Angela's book. We've put a link in the chat for that. And our last summer event is posted up online right now, tomorrow, 3 p.m. Mountain, 5 p.m. Eastern, what every American should know. Please join us. Thank you.